Last week, an explosion occurred in Beirut. The disaster was preceded by a large fire at the port of Beirut on the city's northern Mediterranean coast. Shortly after 6 p.m., the roof of the warehouse caught alight and there was a large initial explosion followed by a colossal one. That blast caused extensive damage over much of the rest of the capital, affecting 163 public and private schools and rendered half of Beirut's healthcare centers non-functional. 200 people were killed and another 5,000 were injured. After the explosion, many questions arose because people have thought it was a nuclear explosion due to the form of fungus that was generated, associated with nuclear detonation. What happened in Lebanon was nothing related to a nuclear explosion. It was a phenomenon called the Wilson cloud that happens when large explosions occur in sufficiently humid air.
But do you know the implication that this explosion brings to the country and what the current national situation is? Lebanon is currently facing one of the worst economic crises in recent history, which has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, aggravated by the refugee calamity in the Middle East, systematic failures across the banking sector in conflict with Syria, and the general perception of corruption. There have been increasing humanitarian needs in the region for both refugees and host communities.
Speaking of the implications of the explosion, the issue of the refugee crisis in Lebanon arises. Lebanon, due to its neighbors and position, welcomes refugees from Syria, a country with which it shares most of its land border, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, and more. Lebanon has more than 1 million Syrians and over 400,000 long-term refugees from Palestine, now living among a national population of 4 million. The country now has the highest per capita concentration of refugees in the world. For Beirut's large refugee and migrant population, including many women who are living domestic workers without a support system in the country, the housing situation is even more precarious, as the explosion left 300,000 people temporarily homeless. This adds up to the almost 250,000 migrant workers, mainly from Ethiopia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, that are excluded from national labor law protections. Also, their legal residency depends on their employer under the kafala system. This system leads to a lot of abuses, including non-payment of wages, forced confinement, excessive working hours, and verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. Many migrant workers were unable to return to their countries and were fired from their jobs because of the economic crisis and COVID-19 in May 2020. Several employers abandoned migrant domestic workers and left them outside their embassies. They argued that their employers had stopped paying them and refused to provide them tickets to return home. Many of them were without their belongings and without passports.
In the eyes of international community, the Lebanese situation represents a threat. Syria, Iran, and Saudi Arabia maintain a strong influence on Lebanese politics through local allies. In general context and from previous years, Lebanon has been recognized as having a government that lacks transparency, limited economic opportunities, corruption, and inadequate quality of life. These situations have alarmed US policymakers, as well as leaders of partner states in Europe and the Persian Gulf. US policymakers remain focused on mitigating the instability in Lebanon in order to find a diplomatic solution to the Syrian civil war and to prevent the growing influence of Iran in the region.
The foreign policy of Lebanon is split between the interests of different internal Lebanese groups working in alliance with external actors. The competing interests of these internal groups have compromised the cohesion of the Lebanese state and its capacity to promote its own interests above those of the different internal groups and non-state actors, such as militias and terrorist groups, which are a constant concern to the US and the international community. Hezbollah is an Iranian-backed militia considered the most powerful and popular organization in Lebanon. Its armed component has been involved in the Syrian civil war, which has exacerbated ongoing tensions between this group and Israel along the shared and disputed Israel-Lebanon border and has led to increasingly hostile rhetorical exchanges between Hezbollah and Israel over Israeli airstrikes in Syria. The U.S. has said Iran continues to ship arms to Hezbollah and Lebanon with an aim to build capabilities that could strike Israel to the south. In the 2006 Lebanon war, the Hezbollah paramilitary forces and the Israeli military were the principal parties. But also, it is important to note that this war took an important role in the international law context, as the United Nations established a tribunal of an international character to try all those who are elected responsible for the attack of 14 February 2005 in Beirut that killed the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri and 22 others.
In international context, the Lebanese government has moreover cooperated with international actors, such as European Union, the United Nations, and the World Bank, with a view to implementing youth-based projects targeting job creation, empowerment, citizenship, and peace building. In the wake of the Syrian conflict and its spillover effects, international projects have drawn on youth politics as a key requisite to boosting Lebanon's social cohesion and resilience. In specific terms, Lebanon has participation and projects with Amnesty International, the World Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Health Organization, and the European Commission.
Lebanon has also been known as the Switzerland of the Middle East for decades because of its strict banking secrecy laws, but as the country falls deeper into economic crisis and debt, the banks that once drew so much foreign capital to the country are also in trouble. Lebanon's economy is in crisis. GDP contraction could top 20% in 2020. The local currency has lost more than 60% of its value on secondary exchange markets, and even more after the Beirut explosion. Corruption and a lack of transparency have continued to cause frustration among locals and foreign businesses, but the country has actually the legal underpinnings of a free market economy, a highly educated labor force, and limit restrictions on investors. The most alluring sector is the energy sector, particularly for power production, renewable energies, and oil and gas exploration, information and communication technology, healthcare, safety and security, waste management, and franchising.